5 a.m., a maximum security cell in Texas. No walls were broken, no locks were picked, no sirens wailed. Only a telephone and a name whose status had just been silently changed in the system.
Stephen Russell was gone!
What stunned investigators the most was not that he had escaped, but that this was the fourth time. Not with a gun, not with violence, not by digging a tunnel. Only with his voice, his confidence, and a series of impersonation phone calls so perfect that the prison opened its own doors. One telephone was enough to escape 4 times. And it was because of that same telephone that Stephen Russell faced an unimaginable price. 144 years in prison, a sentence not meant for a human lifetime. But how could this have happened? Stephen Russell, a diligent accountant, seemed to live an ordinary life. But fate played a cruel trick on him. He lost his job and was pushed into desperation. Instead of choosing to get back on his feet, Stephen chose a path few would dare to take. He became a con artist, turning his life into a series of plays where he was both the director and the leading actor. Stephen realized that laws and security barriers could be penetrated by social engineering and psychological manipulation. His criminal journey was marked by 3 spectacular escapes, where his intellect and acting skills turned impenetrable prisons into wide-open doors, and in each escape, the art of impersonation through communication devices played a key role. His first escape in 1992 was a clear testament to the philosophy that if you act like you belong, no one will question you. Observing that maintenance workers moved freely in and out of the prison in civilian clothes with walkie-talkies, Stephen had a set of plain clothes and a radio smuggled in. He changed, clipped the walkie-talkie to his belt, and calmly walked out the main gate. By impersonating a busy employee communicating on his device, he completely deceived the guards, who trusted him implicitly and opened the gate, leaving behind a security system defeated by a walkie-talkie and sheer confidence. After some time on the run, during which he even climbed to the position of chief financial officer of a major corporation by setting up a call forwarding system to impersonate his own references, Stephen was arrested again for financial fraud. Facing a staggering $950,000 bail at the Harris County Jail, Stephen executed his second escape, this time relying entirely on his innate talent for voice impersonation over the phone. He gained access to a prison phone and called the records office directly. Posing as Judge Charles Ham, he used an authoritative tone and precise legal terminology to order his own bail reduced to $45,000. Not stopping there, he then called a bail bond company, using his masterful manipulation to persuade them to post his bond. Through these magical impersonation calls, Stephen once again walked out of prison under a cloak of legitimacy. This escape was short-lived, as a phone signal gave away his location in Florida. Returned to prison with a 40-year sentence and tightened security, Stephen remained defiant. He realized the green scrubs worn by medical staff were a powerful ticket to freedom. He painstakingly collected green highlighters to dye his white prison uniform the color of a doctor's scrubs. On Friday, December 13th, 1996, he put on his disguise and waited for the right moment. He had observed carefully and took advantage of a female guard who was distracted by a personal phone call. Stephen approached, carrying himself with the poised demeanor of a doctor finishing his shift, knocked on the door, and gestured. The guard's inattention, coupled with Stephen's flawless appearance, allowed him to slip through security one more time, completing a stunning hat trick of escapes through a combination of disguise and psychological warfare. For an ordinary person, escaping 3 times would be an unimaginable feat. But for Stephen Russell, this was not yet his peak. Unable to swallow the humiliation of being outsmarted 3 times, Texas authorities knew they could no longer play a conventional cat-and-mouse game. They brought in their ace special agent Terry Capps, head of the Special Operations Unit, a government bounty hunter who specialized in the toughest cases. For Terry and his team, allowing an unarmed man like Stephen Russell to turn a maximum security prison into an easy exit was an unforgivable disgrace. Terry threw himself into the manhunt with the mindset of someone reclaiming his honor. The special task force scoured every inch of Huntsville, but Stephen was long gone. However, no matter how clever he was, Stephen couldn't erase every digital footprint. Terry and his team persistently followed phone traces, identified a contact, and narrowed Stephen's location to Biloxi. An urgent warrant with Stephen's photo was sent to the local sheriff. And then fate played another cruel trick on Stephen in the most ironic way possible. He was caught by pure chance. The Biloxi sheriff, holding the newly received wanted poster, stepped outside and came face to face with the most wanted fugitive. In a strange city among tens of thousands of people, what were the odds of them meeting? It was as if fate was telling Stephen, "Your magic has run out." He was handcuffed and escorted back to Texas, where a 45-year sentence with no parole awaited him. If his question the first 3 times was how to get out this time, it was how to no longer be a person who is incarcerated. This was not just an escape. It was his gamble for permanent freedom, so no one could ever hunt him again. We often think of prison as a place that confines the body. That's true, but it's not the whole story. What confines a person more permanently is their file name, ID number, legal status sentence. A body can move, but a file cannot. Stephen understood this. He knew that to be truly free, he needed to disappear completely from those records. From this point, the logic of his plan was not a sequence of actions, but a sequence of conditions. The first condition sounded paradoxical: to be released, you must not escape. The system doesn't release fugitives. It releases those classified as no longer a threat. And in any modern prison, no longer a threat can sometimes mean not expected to live much longer. The second condition: to disappear from the records meant to cease to exist. In administrative governance, death is a final status. The name is struck from the list, the ID number is closed, and the file is archived forever. Simply put, a legal death. It didn't have to be a biological death, but the moment the system officially recognized the termination of existence. Once the stamp was applied, biological reality became secondary. And the final condition was the inevitable consequence: if you don't exist, you can't be hunted. You cannot pursue someone who is no longer alive. No subject, no jurisdiction, no budget. A manhunt requires a valid target. When the target vanishes from the legal map, the chase dissolves on its own. While studying parole regulations, he discovered an extremely dangerous loophole. Inmates with serious terminal illnesses, especially late-stage AIDS, could be released for outside treatment and granted compassionate parole. And so, Stephen decided to execute the most audacious plan of his life. Fake having AIDS, then fake his own death. First, he starved himself for months, causing his body to become emaciated and severely weakened. Then he induced vomiting, faked symptoms of exhaustion and depletion, and constantly complained of pain and fatigue. Simultaneously, Stephen bribed a system employee to forge his medical records to state that he was HIV/AIDS positive. For 8 months, Stephen lay bedridden, playing the part of a dying patient. Amazingly, the prison doctors never re-verified his condition, completely trusting the falsified medical file. To complete the act, Stephen took the most dangerous step, putting himself into a coma. He secretly stockpiled sedatives for days, then took an overdose, causing his body to fall into a coma that lasted for 4 consecutive days. When he awoke, the doctors were convinced he had only weeks to live. Not long after, Stephen was granted medical parole and transferred to a special care center in Texas. But that was still not the end. On January 16, 1998, Stephen J. Russell's file status was changed with just a few strokes of a pen. Special needs parole, a door not for escapees, but for someone deemed to be at the end of their life. This was a case of humane resolution. In the following weeks, he was moved to Restful Acres Care Center in Kennedy, a long-term care facility where the smell of antiseptic and the sound of rolling gurneys replaced the clang of iron locks. Here, he was seen through a different lens, not as an inmate, but as a patient. In the medical world, what holds power isn't handcuffs, but medical records and the voice of a doctor. And so, the next link in the chain was activated by a small but crucial detail: a phone call. Stephen impersonated an AIDS specialist named Dr. Adam Ruse, his tone calm, professional, and utterly convincing. He called the care center, the prison, and the parole officer in charge of his case. In each call, he told the same story. He stated that the patient, Stephen Russell, had been selected for an experimental treatment program, but his condition had deteriorated too rapidly. The patient's body had failed, and his organs were shutting down one by one. All medical interventions had been unsuccessful. Stephen's voice never trembled. It was not rushed. There was no excess emotion. He spoke as if he announced patients' deaths every day. Then, to complete the charade, Stephen forged a death certificate, stating the cause of death was severe complications from AIDS. He signed Dr. Adam Ruse's name perfectly. The seal, the signature, every detail was so authentic that no one suspected a thing. News of Russell's death reached his parole officer and spread like an officially stamped message. The subject no longer exists. And when a subject no longer exists, the pursuit becomes a bizarre exercise. Who are you chasing, and on what legal grounds, when their file is being sent to the archives? Russell didn't need a city to hide in. He just needed a few days for the system to believe it was all over. His fourth escape, therefore, felt more like an administrative case than a prison break. A name status was changed, a phone call was believed, a death was accepted, and a man walked out of sight without needing to disappear from the world, only from paper. And because it was so smooth, so by the book, so unsuspicious, it was all the more terrifying. The prison wasn't broken into. The prison opened its own doors because it had been convinced that the person inside was no longer a person to be confined. For the first time in years, Stephen was truly and completely free. For the first few weeks, he kept a low profile. His body gradually recovered from the long period of starvation and self-harm. His strength returned, and his mind was sharper than ever. If he had known when to stop, Stephen might have escaped for good. But the problem was, Stephen didn't know how to stop. His fraudulent nature, his craving for control, and the feeling of having beaten the system made him believe he was invincible. He started down the old path: forgery, deception, manipulation. His first mistake was creating a fake lawyer's ID. Stephen walked into a print shop and requested a card identical to a bar association card. The shop owner was suspicious, but complied. After Stephen left, the owner felt uneasy and reported it to the police, providing a copy of the card. When Houston police saw the photo on the ID, they immediately recognized a strange resemblance to Stephen Russell, a man whose file said he was dead. This information quickly reached Terry Capps, the agent who had hunted Stephen multiple times. Terry could hardly believe his ears. He contacted the prison, only to receive a cold response. Stephen had been paroled due to terminal AIDS and had died outside the facility. It was then that Terry understood. Stephen had fooled the entire system once again. A new manhunt began. Just weeks after his death, Stephen appeared at a Dallas bank, posing as a millionaire and applying for a $75,000 loan. The bank's vice president became suspicious and secretly called the FBI. Sensing something was wrong, Stephen immediately faked a stroke, demanded an ambulance, and left the bank amidst the chaos. It seemed he had escaped again. But this time, the FBI was close behind. Stephen was detained at the hospital pending an investigation. However, with his usual confidence, he made a phone call impersonating an FBI agent, announcing that the investigation was over and ordering the hospital to release him. The hospital believed him. When the FBI returned, Stephen was gone, leaving behind only his driver's license with his real photo, confirming he was still in Dallas. This was his fatal mistake. Terry and his special operations team immediately established a perimeter. By tracking his transactions, the hotels he stayed in, and an insurance company he was trying to defraud via fax, they pinpointed his area of operation. The chase ended ironically. Stephen was spotted by two detectives while walking down the street with no act or disguise to hide behind. This time, there would be no leniency. Stephen was sentenced to 144 years in prison, with no possibility of parole. He was sent to the highest security unit, typically reserved for the most dangerous murderers. He is kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, allowed out for only 1 hour for showering and exercise under strict supervision. The number 144 years is not an ordinary sentence. It is not designed for a human to serve. No one in the courtroom believed anyone could live long enough to pay off a 144-year debt. The number isn't about time. It's about a message. If the goal were merely punishment, the system had many familiar options. 30 years, 50 years, even 80 years. Those numbers would have been enough to ensure Stephen Russell would never return to society as a viable threat. But 144 years is different. It transcends all biological norms. So what was the system punishing? Looking at his list of crimes, Stephen was not a mass murderer. He used no violence, no terrorism, no direct physical harm. Compared to other dangerous criminals, Stephen seemed far gentler, yet his sentence was heavier than many of theirs. This discrepancy is not a mistake. It is a signal. The system was not punishing his actions in the conventional sense. It was punishing his ability. The ability to make the system look foolish. The ability to force institutions to look in the mirror and see the blind spots they refuse to acknowledge. The 144-year sentence, therefore, was not just for Stephen Russell. It was a warning to anyone who might follow a similar path. Do not experiment with our structure. The price will be your permanent disappearance. Looking back at Stephen Russell's entire journey, it is easy to be captivated by his intelligence, audacity, and unbelievable escapes. He didn't use violence, guns, break walls, or dig tunnels. The only tools he used were his words, his confidence, and his ability to manipulate people. For a long time, these very things made Stephen believe he was above the system, that the law was just a game that could be bent by the mind. Each successful escape reinforced that belief. But Stephen never realized one crucial thing. The system can be fooled, but time cannot. The more he ran, the more traces he left behind. The more roles he played, the less he knew who he was. And the more he won with cunning, the more he lost the ability to stop. His fourth escape, the perfectly executed fake illness and death, should have been the end. It was the one moment Stephen could have truly vanished, becoming a name that no longer existed. But it was then that his true nature was most exposed. He was addicted to the feeling of control and victory. Stephen didn't just want to be free. He wanted to prove he was smarter than everyone else. And that is why he returned to fraud, to acting, to stepping back into the light, even though a single appearance was enough to bring it all crashing down. It wasn't because he was less intelligent than before, but because his arrogance had clouded his judgment. Today, Stephen lives in high-security solitary confinement, where there is no longer an audience for his performances. No one left to manipulate with his voice. 23 hours a day pass in silence, leaving him with only his own thoughts, the very thing he spent his entire life trying to escape. Stephen once faked death to live. In the end, he must live as a man who is dead to freedom. And perhaps the heaviest punishment for Stephen is not the 144-year sentence. but the fact that he no longer has the chance to prove anything to anyone. This story is not just about a four-time escape artist. It is a reminder that intelligence without limits becomes a knife that turns against the one who holds it. That is the end for a man who once challenged the entire system and lost the game against himself.